Aileen Wuornos, the damsel of death.
Between 1989 and 1990, a woman hitchhiking along Florida's highways murdered 7 men in cold blood, and she convinced everyone she was the real victim in these crimes. This is the story of Aileen Carol Wuornos, and it's one of the most disturbing and tragic cases in American criminal history. Before we dive in, I want to be clear about something. This case isn't about glorifying violence or making a killer into a folk hero. This is about understanding how circumstances, trauma, and mental illness can create a perfect storm that ends in tragedy. So stick with me as we break down exactly what happened. Aileen Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Michigan, and her life began in darkness. Her mother was a teenager when she had her, and her father was a violent convicted child molester. Her grandmother eventually took her in, but childhood was never going to be normal for Aileen.
By age 11, she was trading sexual favors for food and cigarettes.
By 13, she was pregnant with her first child, a boy she gave up for adoption.
Her family basically threw her out after that.
She was homeless, hungry, and angry at a world that had chewed her up and spat her out before she even became a teenager. She survived on the margins of society throughout her teenage years and 20s. Sometimes she'd find work as a dancer or in other service jobs, but she struggled with alcohol and drug addiction.
She drifted between shelters and the homes of men she'd meet, often trading intimacy for survival.
This wasn't a glamorous life or some kind of adventure.
This was desperation wearing a human face.
By 1989, when she was 33 years old, Aileen was still living hand-to-mouth. She was working as a sex worker on Florida's highways, standing on the side of the road waiting for men to pick her up. This is where our story truly begins, and it's where everything spirals into chaos. On December 1, 1989, Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics repairman, picked up Aileen outside a bar in Volusia County. According to Aileen's account, which she would later give to police, Mallory drove her to an abandoned road and attempted to rape her. She said he had a gun, and she managed to take control of it during the struggle. She shot him 9 times. When she reported this to police, they didn't find his body immediately. Aileen drove away in his car and left him dead in the woods.
Here's the thing that would haunt this entire case: Richard Mallory's death was ruled self-defense by the state attorney.
Aileen had a legitimate legal argument that she feared for her life. She had a history of sexual assault and abuse.
Mallory's death could have ended right there as a justifiable homicide. But it didn't. Over the next 10 months, 6 more men would be found dead along Florida's highways. David Spears in May 1990.
Charles Carskadden that same month.
Peter Seams in June. Troy Burress in July.
Charles Humphreys in September.
Walter Gino Antonio in November.
Each man had been shot multiple times.
Each man had been robbed.
And each time, Aileen's story changed slightly. Sometimes she claimed they had guns. Sometimes she claimed they were aggressive. Sometimes she claimed they wanted kinky sex that turned violent. The pattern was undeniable, and by fall 1990, the Florida authorities knew they were looking for a serial killer. They just didn't know who she was yet.
And this is where the investigation takes a dramatic turn. Here's your mid-video cliffhanger: the evidence that would eventually catch Aileen didn't come from eyewitnesses or ballistics.
It came from her best friend. Aileen had met a woman named Tyria Moore in 1986, and they'd become extremely close. When the murders started, Aileen was living with Tyria. Now, as the body count climbed and the police net tightened, Aileen made a critical mistake. She trusted Tyria with the truth. She told her about the murders. She told her where some of the bodies were. And when police found out that Aileen had a close associate, they made Tyria an offer.
Tyria Moore became the state's key witness.
But here's what makes this truly stunning: Tyria wasn't coerced into testifying. She cooperated with police, and she helped them by essentially getting Aileen to confess during recorded phone calls while she was in custody. Tyria basically betrayed the woman she claimed to love to save herself, and honestly, you can't blame her. She was facing possible charges as an accessory after the fact.
On January 16, 1991, Aileen Wuornos was arrested at a biker bar in Florida. Almost immediately, she started talking to police. She confessed to 6 of the 7 murders. For Richard Mallory, she maintained it was self-defense. For the others, her story was murky. She said these men tried to rape her or hurt her, but she also admitted to robbing them. She needed their money to survive. She was desperate. The trial began in January 1992, and it was a media circus. Aileen maintained that she was a victim protecting herself from violent sexual predators. The prosecution argued she was a calculated killer who murdered men for money. The evidence was damning. There were witness accounts of men picking up a woman matching Aileen's description days before they died. There were the weapons. There was her confession. But there was also her history of abuse. There was evidence of severe psychological trauma. There were years of exploitation and violence that had shaped her into something desperate and dangerous. None of this excused murder, but it explained it. The jury didn't care about explanations. On May 15, 1992, Aileen Wuornos was convicted of the murder of Richard Mallory. She was sentenced to death. Over the next few years, she would be convicted and sentenced to death for the murders of 3 more men. She was executed by electric chair on October 9, 2002, at the age of 46. Her final words were reportedly a request for an apple, a cup of coffee, and a couple of cigarettes. She died angry, and she died believing she was right. So what does this case really tell us? Here's what haunts me about Aileen Wuornos: she was a victim who became a killer. She was abused, homeless, and desperate, and instead of the system protecting her, it abandoned her. By the time she murdered those men, she was broken in ways that were probably irreparable. That doesn't mean she shouldn't have been punished. It doesn't mean her victims didn't matter. They absolutely did. Those 7 men had families. They had lives that were cut short by violence. But it does mean we failed her. Society failed her. The system failed her. And when we talk about Aileen Wuornos, we're really talking about systemic failure. We're talking about what happens to children who have no one. We're talking about the vulnerability of people living on the fringes. We're talking about how trauma compounds and echoes through generations. Aileen Wuornos was executed over 20 years ago, but her story remains relevant because the conditions that created her still exist. There are still homeless women working sex work on highways. There are still children being sexually abused by family members. There are still people slipping through every crack in the system. What do you think about this case? Do you believe Aileen's claims of self-defense, or do you think she was a calculated killer? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed for more deep dives into true crime history.